When Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation in Ukraine, he probably thought it would be a walk in the park. But instead of a quick victory lap, Putin found himself in a marathon he didn't sign up for. The initial expectations were high. Russian propaganda painted a picture of a swift, decisive victory. They promised to be in Kyiv by dinner time. The world held its breath, fearing Ukraine would fall within days. But as Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And boy, did Ukraine pack a punch. Instead of rolling out the welcome mat, Ukrainians rolled out their sleeves and prepared for a fight. The expected quick capitulation turned into a fierce resistance that caught Russia off guard. Putin's dream of a new Russian empire was quickly turning into a nightmare. The world watched in disbelief as David stood up to Goliath. In the early days of the invasion, it seemed like Russia might actually pull off its audacious plan. Russian troops were advancing rapidly towards Kyiv, and the world watched with bated breath. For a moment, it looked like checkmate was imminent. Russian forces pushed hard, getting within earshot of Kyiv. The situation was so dire that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy was offered evacuation. But in a moment that would define the conflict, Zelenskyy famously replied, "I need ammunition, not a ride." But then, something unexpected happened. The Russian war machine, supposedly a well-oiled behemoth, started to sputter and stall. Supply lines stretched thin like a rubber band about to snap. As Russian troops neared Kyiv, they found themselves not in a victory parade, but in a traffic jam of epic proportions. Kyiv stood firm, and the Russian bear retreated with its tail between its legs. Just when it seemed like David might run out of stones for his slingshot, the West decided to step in. The United States, always ready for a sequel to the Cold War, led the charge. They started sending everything short of the kitchen sink to Ukraine. HIMARS, javelins, and enough military equipment to make a Call of Duty player drool. European countries followed suit, dusting off their Cold War-era stockpiles and shipping them east. This influx of Western support changed the dynamics of the war faster than you can say geopolitical shift. Suddenly, Ukrainian soldiers found themselves trading in their Soviet-era gear for NATO standard equipment. The playing field, once tilted in Russia's favor, started to level out. Economic sanctions hit Russia harder than a Klitschko punch. The Russian economy took a nosedive faster than you can say ruble trouble. As the conflict dragged on, Putin's special military operation started to look less special and more like a regular old war. The lightning-fast victory he had hoped for turned into a slow, grinding slog. The war settled into a pattern of advances and counterattacks, with both sides digging in for the long haul. This war of attrition started to take its toll on both sides, but especially on Russia. The mighty Russian war machine, once thought invincible, started to show signs of wear and tear. Tanks broke down, planes got shot down, and soldiers' morale sank lower than the Moskva in the Black Sea. Putin found himself in a quagmire of his own making with no easy way out. As the war dragged on, Russia's mighty tank force started to look less mighty and more like a collection of very expensive lawn ornaments. The once feared Russian armored divisions were being picked off faster than contestants in a reality TV show. The depletion of Russia's modern tanks became a running joke in military circles. T-90s, once the pride of the Russian army, were being turned into scrap metal at an alarming rate. The Ukrainian farmers, armed with tractors and a can-do attitude, became the unlikely heroes of this tank saga, towing away abandoned Russian armor like they were repossessing cars. Modern tanks don't grow on trees, and Russia's ability to replace these losses quickly became a question mark bigger than the one on the Riddler's costume. To make matters worse, Western sanctions put a wrench in Russia's tank production plans. Russia found itself in a tank deficit, trying to fight a 21st century war with a rapidly depleting 20th century arsenal. Let's talk numbers, shall we? Because nothing says military disaster quite like cold, hard statistics. According to various intelligence reports and open-source information, Russia's tank losses in Ukraine have been more staggering than the plot twists in a telenovela. We're talking about losses in the thousands, folks. To put it in perspective, some estimates suggest that Russia has lost more tanks in Ukraine than some countries have in their entire arsenal. By some counts, Russia has lost over 2,000 tanks since the invasion began. Now let's compare these losses to Russia's production capabilities. Before the war, Russia was producing around 250 tanks per year. Even if we're generous and assume Russia has ramped up production, which is doubtful given the sanctions, they're still losing tanks faster than they can make them. The math is not in Russia's favor. Some experts estimate it would take Russia decades to replace the tanks lost in Ukraine. As Russia's tank supply dwindled faster than ice cream on a hot summer day, their military brass had to get creative. Reports started emerging of Russian troops using some rather unconventional vehicles on the battlefield. Move over T-90S, make way for golf carts? Yes, you heard that right, golf carts. The kind of vehicle you'd expect to see ferrying retirees around a Florida resort was spotted being used by Russian troops in Ukraine. Russian troops were also seen using civilian vehicles repurposed for military use. Pickup trucks, vans, and even the occasional tractor were pressed into service. These makeshift military vehicles were about as effective in combat as a paper airplane in a dogfight. The sight of Russian troops puttering around in golf carts and civilian vehicles became a source of both humor and bewilderment for observers. It was a far cry from the fearsome Russian war machine that had been hyped up for decades. As Russia's supply of modern tanks dwindled, they started reaching deep into their reserves. And by deep, I mean they were pulling out tanks so old they probably fought in the Battle of Stalingrad. We're talking about tanks that were considered cutting edge during the Cuban Missile Crisis. These vintage vehicles, lovingly referred to as museum pieces by military analysts, started appearing on the battlefield like unwanted guests at a party. T-62ES, a tank design from the 1960s, made a comeback tour in Ukraine. These old tanks were about as well suited for modern combat as a knight in shining armor would be in a gunfight. The problem with these antique armored vehicles isn't just their age. These old tanks lack the advanced optics, fire control systems, and protection of their modern counterparts. In the fast-paced, high-tech battlefield of today, they're about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. As these old tanks rumble onto the battlefield, they're not just fighting against Ukrainian forces, they're fighting against time itself.